Greetings to all of you, my dear sisters and brothers, and my dear friends, and a warm welcome to all of you from your pastor, Yeti. Together in Be Encouraged, the study of the 2 Corinthians letter, we are in chapter 7. And this study of 2 Corinthians chapter 8 of the letters to the Corinthians is the grace of giving in part 1. And I will have to split it in 4 parts because it's too much. So, let's start to encourage one another. One of the major ministries of Paul's third missionary journey was the taking up of a special relief offering for the poor Christians in Judea. Once before Paul had assisted in this way, you can look it up in Acts 11:27-30, and he was happy to do it again. It is significant that it was Paul who remembered the forgotten beatitude of our Lord. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Acts 20:35. But Paul had other blessings in mind besides the material assisting of the poor. He wanted this offering to strengthen the unity of the church as the Gentile churches shared with the Jewish congregations across the sea. Paul saw the Gentiles as debtors to the Jews, and the special collection was one way to pay that debt. This offering was also evidence to the Jewish believers, some of whom were still zealous for the law, that Paul was not the enemy of the Jews or of Moses. Early in his ministry, Paul had promised to remember the poor, and he labored to keep that promise. But at the same time, he hoped that the generosity of the Gentiles would silence the jealousy of the Jews. Unfortunately, the Corinthians were not doing their part. Like many people, they had made promises, but they failed to keep them. In fact, an entire year has been wasted. What was the cause of this serious delay? The low spiritual level of the church. When a church is not spiritual, it is not generous. Another factor was the invasion of the Judaizers, who probably siphoned off as much money as they could. Paul knew that it would be difficult to get the Corinthians to participate, so he lifted his appeal to the highest spiritual level possible. He taught them that giving was an act of grace. Paul used 9 different words to refer to the offering, but the one he used the most was grace. Giving is truly a ministry and fellowship. 2 Corinthians 8 verse 4, that helps others. But the motivations must be from the grace of God in the heart. Paul knew that this collection was a debt owned by the Gentiles and fruit from their Christian lives. But it was even more. It was the working of the grace of God in humans' hearts. It is a wonderful thing when Christians enter into the grace of giving, when they really believe that giving is more blessed than receiving. How can we tell when we are practicing grace giving? Paul indicated that there were a number of evidence that appears when our giving is motivated by grace. We're going to step into that. When we give in spite of circumstances, chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. The Macedonian churches that Paul was using as an example had experienced severe difficulties, and yet they had given generously. They had not simply going through affliction, they had experienced a great trial of afflictions. 2 Corinthians 8 verse 2. They were deep in poverty, which means rock bottom destitution. The word describes a beggar who has absolutely nothing and has no hope of getting anything. Their difficult situation may have been caused in part by their Christian faith, for they may have lost their jobs or been excluded from the trade guilds because they refused to have anything to do with idolatry. But their circumstances did not hinder them from giving. In fact, they gave joyfully and liberally. No computer could analyze this amazing formula. Great affliction and deep poverty, plus grace equals abundant joy and abounding liberty. It reminds us of the paradox in Paul's ministry, as poor yet making many rich. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 10. It is also reminds us of the generous offerings that were taken at the building of the tabernacle, Exodus 35 verses 5 and 6, and the temple. When you have experienced the grace of God in your life, you will not use difficult circumstances as an excuse for not giving. For that matter, are circumstances even an encouragement to giving? Another one. When we give enthusiastically, chapter 8 verses 3 and 4, it is possible to give generously but not give enthusiastically. Excuse me. The preacher says, I should give until it hurts, said a miserly church member. But for me, it hurts just to think about giving. The Macedonian churches needed to prompting or reminding, as did the church at Corinth. They were more than willing to share in the collection. In fact, they begged to be included. 2 Corinthians 8 chapter 4 verse 4, excuse me. How many times have you heard a Christian beg for something or for somebody to take an offering? Their giving was voluntarily and spontaneous. It was of grace and not pressure. They gave because they wanted to give and because they had experienced the grace of God. Grace not only frees us from our sins, but it frees us from ourselves. The grace of God will open your heart and your hand. Your giving is not the result of cold calculation, but of warm-hearted jubilation. Another one. When we give as Jesus gave. 8:5-9. Jesus Christ is always the preeminent example for the believer to follow, whether in service, suffering, or sacrifice. Like Jesus Christ, the Macedonian Christians gave themselves to God and to others. If we give ourselves to God, we will have little problem giving our substance to God. If we give ourselves to God, we will also give of ourselves for others. It is impossible to love God and ignore the needs of your neighbor. Jesus Christ gave himself for us. Should we not give ourselves to him? He died so that we might not live for ourselves, but for him and for others. The Macedonians' giving was like Christ, motivating by love. What a rebuke to the Corinthians, who were so enriched with spiritual blessings. They were so wrapped up in the gifts of the Spirit that they had neglected the graces of the Spirit, including the grace of giving. The Macedonian churches had an abundance of deep poverty. and yet they abounded in their liberality. The Corinthians had an abundance of spiritual gifts, yet they were lax in keeping their promise and sharing in the collection. We must never argue that the ministry of our spiritual gifts is a substitute for generous giving. Paul argued just the opposite. Since you are wonderful, gifted from God, you ought to want to give even more. Paul was careful that they understood that he was not ordering them to give. Actually, he was contrasting the attitude of the Macedonians with that of the Corinthians. He was pointing out that the Macedonians were following the example of the Lord. They were poor, yet they gave. The Corinthians said that they loved Paul. Now he asked them to prove that love by sharing in the offering. Grace giving is an evidence of love for Christ, love for God's servant who have ministered to us, and love for those who have special needs that we are able to help meet. Finally, their giving was sacrificial. 2 Corinthians 8 verse 9. In what ways was Jesus rich? Certainly he was rich in his person, for he is eternal God. He is rich in his possessions and in his position as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is rich in his power, for he can do anything. Yet, in spite of the fact that he had all these riches and more, he became poor. The tense of the verb indicates that it is his incarnation, his birth at Bethlehem, that is meant here. He united himself to mankind and took on himself a human body. He left the throne to become a servant. He laid aside all his possessions so that he did not even have a place to lay his head. His ultimate experience of poverty was when he was made sin for us on the cross. Hell is eternal poverty, and on the cross, Jesus became the poorest of the poor. Why did he do it? That we might become rich. This suggests that we were poor before we met Jesus Christ, and we were totally bankrupt. But now that we have trusted him, we share in all of his riches. We are now the children of God, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. Romans 8:17. Since this is true, how can we refuse to give to others? He became poor to make us rich. Can we not follow his example, as did the Macedonian churches, who out of their deep poverty abounded in liberality? When we give willingly, chapter 8, verse 10 and 12, there is a great difference between promise and performance. The Christians had boasted to Titus a year before that they would share in the special collection, but they did not keep their promise. Note that in 2 Corinthians 8 verses 10 and 12, Paul emphasized willingness. Grace giving must come from a willing heart. It cannot be coerced or forced. We must be careful here not to confuse willing with doing, because the two must go together. If the willing is sincere in the will of God, then there must be a performance also. Paul did not say that willing was a substitute for doing, because it is not. But if our giving is motivated by grace, we will give willingly and not because we have been forced to give. God sees the heart gift and not the hand gift. If the heart wanted to give more, but was unable to do so, God sees it and records it accordingly. But if the hand gives more than the heart wants to give, God records what is in the heart, no matter how big the offering in the hand might be. If we could have given more and did not, God knows it. If we want to give more and could not, God also knows that. When we give willingly, according to what we have, we are practicing grace giving. And I want to stop here, my dear ones. Otherwise, it's going to be too much in one part. Because we talked about a lot about the heart. And that is the right place to come in awareness. Viewing our life and where we stand. It's very interesting that St. Francis said, it's in the giving that we receive. And it's a spiritual blessing. I think at the time that we consider to give, it will not always direct the right place. Because we always think, is it okay in what we give? Is it right to give that many or that less? Because. So we have to think it together with our heart. Because God also knows that. When we give willingly according to what we have, we are practicing grace giving. And I speak to myself also. Blessings to all of you, my dear ones. This is your Pastor Yeti. So tomorrow we start on part 2. And then we still have 2 to go after that. I love you guys. And sorry for my wrong saying in the chapters. So I could not get out of my words, if I may say so. Okay. I love you guys. Bye.